Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. You know, UK government borrowing has soared by 10%. Yes, thanks to declining wages, the increasingly bankrupt government is a sinking ship on Osborne's river of denial that it doesn't always end this way for feudalism. Stacey?
Yes, Max. Well, we have quite a few headlines coming up about feudalism, but first I want to start with a very positive, non-feudalist story, which is that you and I will have the first male and female Sasquatches in America named after us. This is the North American Sasquatch Expedition, and they're crowdfunding on StartJoin, and they're going to go hunting for Sasquatch, and the first female will be named Stacey because I was the first to donate.
Okay, so there are Sasquatches that will be named after us as part of a project that's being crowdfunded on StartJoin. So, and this includes StartCoin, where the free coins every Friday. You get free coins every Friday, StartCoin?
Yes, because Sasquatch are not able to spend dollars, so they could possibly spend StartCoin. And perhaps you might see a Sasquatch Keiser Report, a version of Keiser Report, but done in Sasquatch.
Well, I think that this is truly a remarkable development in the history of television. Yes. And what else is going on, darling?
Here's a headline that came from Hong Kong and their chief executive there. Hong Kong has too many poor people to allow direct elections, leader says. If it's entirely a numbers game, numeric representation, then obviously you'd be talking to half the people in Hong Kong that earn less than $1,800 a month. You would end up with that kind of politics and policies.
Well, this speaks to this idea and debate currently circulating about why let people vote at all, or should people vote at all?
You know, this has always been the case where it used to be landed people, people who owned land who are allowed to vote. Or in America, they have the Electoral College to, in case democracy, too many peasants vote for the wrong thing, they could overrule them in a way. But we're beyond that into a new era where Hong Kong is not part of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but were they to join that, then they could have all the democracy they want. It doesn't matter. Peasants can vote for whatever they want because these greater global contracts, well, contractual rights and obligations supersede all else. So, you know, we're sorry, but you can vote for, you know, redistribution of wealth or free housing or whatever it might be, or an NHS. But this global contract, we're sorry, our hands are tied. We can't do anything the court says. We have to do what the court says, what the judge says. So, you know, these new global contracts are coming in anyway, so it doesn't matter. That's a new way to get around this. But seemingly, George Osborne can pretend like he's part of TTIP. You know, I would, if I love you people, my voters here, but I would allow you to have this what you want to vote for, but my hands are tied by contracts.
This is extremely dangerous times we live in because, as you point out, that George Osborne and other politicians here in the UK and around the world are allowing for global corporate contracts to supersede local sovereignty. Local sovereignty, i.e. being the sovereignty of the United Kingdom, for example, is being overwritten by corporate contracts, and people like George Osborne and David Cameron and all the leaders here in the UK will say we can't do anything about it. Our hands are tied. The contracts have been signed, and the fact that Monsanto or Exxon or some other company wants to sue the United Kingdom because they perceive that we're destroying their profits in some way, and I have to pay that extortion, and in order to raise money for that extortion, I have to tax you to pay extortion money to foreign occupiers in America. I can't do anything about it. My hands are tied. And this is where the agenda is going forward, and therefore it's not about voting or not voting or incrementally changing things to affect a more representational democracy. It's about a revolution to get rid of the current generation of kleptocrats. And by getting rid of them, I mean taking a scorched earth policy. I mean Maximilian Robespierre kind of reign of terror. Well, it needs to be complete evisceration of an entire generation of kleptocrats, including many monarchs that still rule, still exist. This world is plagued by monarchs.
Well, first of all, we should get somebody to donate for this North American Sasquatch expedition and get Robespierre named for a Sasquatch. And second of all, these sort of global contracts like TTIP and TPP allow for benign dictatorships, benign feudalism. They don't actually, the leaders here, they just say, well, we have this contract it's in the ether. We can't find it. You can't break it. You can't get rid of it. Now, the other thing that's happening, by the way, is this. You mentioned that the income tax revenue here is down, and therefore the government had to borrow 10% more. Also down 15% were Foxtons in one day earlier this week, and just a few days ago, and they're down because the top. The oligarch class seems to be abandoning the UK, abandoning London anyway. And the other thing that is happening is this volatility in the stock market. And I want to turn to this headline, which really proves exactly what Mitch Firestein said in our last interview with him, and that is Goldman makes it official that the stock market is manipulated. Buybacks drive valuations. So Goldman Sachs' Daniel Costin wrote a report, and he believes that this is just a temporary pullback. Don't worry. He said it may explain why the S&P 500 has tumbled is because of the buybacks have had to stop. He said most companies are precluded from engaging in open market stock repurchases during the 5 weeks before releasing earnings. Costin notes, for many firms, the beginning of the blackout period coincided with the S&P 500 peak on September 18th. So the sell-off occurred during a time when the single largest source of equity demand was absent. This is him writing that. And he said, don't worry, because November is the biggest month annually for stock buybacks. And why is November and December? Well, as you always say, Christmas bonus.
Right. Well, this is a definition of a Ponzi scheme. Any Ponzi scheme that relies on paying off the current beneficiaries with new money coming in from new suckers coming at the bottom of the pyramid scheme or Ponzi scheme is by definition a Ponzi scheme. The central banks are acting as the lower level of this Ponzi scheme, pyramid scheme, Bernie Madoff-like structure where the Fed prints tons and tons of money that ends up going into the pockets of the executives of these corporations buying back their own stock. Are they investing in capital? Capital expenditures, improvements, building out their businesses? No, those numbers are at historic lows. Are they, in fact, engaged in any kind of competitive practices that would create more manufacturing jobs in the United States? The answer is absolutely no. On the subject of Foxtons, on this show a year ago, I said that if you were buying London property, you would hedge yourself by selling short Foxtons, the property firm, as a way to hedge yourself against a falling drop in London real estate prices. You can go back on YouTube and find the show. About a year ago, I said this. So if you bought the property a year ago and it's now down 20%, the fact that Foxtons is down 20%, if you had shorted Foxtons, you would now not be losing any money. You would have hedged your bet. I made that point here, and I also made it at Kilkenomics in Kilkenny last year. And I just want to go on record as saying that I said to short Foxtons, it has dropped 50, 60, 70% since that recommendation. It's one of the few recommendations we've made, and it turned out to be ingenious.
Well, of course, George Osborne did not hedge himself, and he still is stuck with this political system whereby he's all fiscal tax and economic policy is geared towards the speculators. The real economy, meanwhile, has collapsed. And I'm going to look at the follow-up on this article about Goldman Sachs admitting that buybacks are the reason why share prices are so high. In the meantime, the real companies, as you point out, they're not investing in the future. And what Eve Smith of Naked Capitalism says about this, she says, notice how the bulk of buybacks are concentrated in the fourth quarter with the obvious intent of goosing prices at year end so as to lead to higher executive pay for, quote, increasing shareholder value. In fact, these companies are being gradually liquidated, issuing debt, which public companies have done in copious volumes since the crash, and using it to buy shares is dissipating corporate assets. They are over time shrinking their businesses. So horrible policy to encourage if you have any interest as a politician, as a leader, as an elected leader of a country for their long-term future and sustainability of your economy.
And as we now know in the UK, as what's happening with Osborne, is that the deficit and the debt are soaring. As again, we predicted here a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we said that the austerity was a hoax, that they could not stop borrowing because you cannot taper a Ponzi scheme. Because if, in fact, he engaged in actual austerity, real austerity, by cutting off the drunks at the bar, that is to say the banks in the City of London, from their free credit and drunken behavior, you would have a collapse. But unfortunately, the way it works is that sometimes it takes a collapse or a scorched earth or a generation-wide evisceration to make room for growth. You know, this is classic, like rotating crops. You know, you got to rotate the crops. You got to rotate this entire current class off a cliff.
And speaking of scorched earth and a drying up of liquidity and a collapse, well, this is a final quick remarkable headline because it's something to look for. Water crisis seen worsening as Sao Paulo nears collapse. So here is an area with more than 40 million people and over 96,000 square miles. Sao Paulo state is geographically bigger than the UK. It's responsible for almost 1/3 of Brazil's gross domestic product. And two of their primary reservoirs that provide water to the 40 million people of Sao Paulo, they're down to 3.3% and 8.5% of capacity. They're on the verge of collapse. 40 million people could be these climate migrants.
It's the grapes of wrath all over again. It's a climate and financial crisis hitting simultaneously. It's the grapes of wrath with a salsa beat. All right, we got to go. Stacey, thanks so much.
Cha-cha-cha.
Oh, I think that could be Stacey Sasquatch. That's what you need to look for, Stacey Sasquatch. Sasquatch. All right, well, stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Helena Norberg-Hodge, who is an analyst of the impact of the global economy on cultures and agriculture worldwide, a pioneer of the localization movement, and the producer and co-director of the award-winning documentary, The Economics of Happiness. She is also the founder and director of localfutures.org. Helena, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thank you. Really glad to be here.
So first of all, let's talk about the economics of happiness.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, for me, it sums up exactly what I'm about and what my organization is about, and the International Alliance for Localization that we're setting up. Basically, we're looking at the relationship between this very remote global economy and our inner well-being. This is something that spans virtually everything that's happening under the sun.
Now, in Bhutan, they have the, don't they have the...
Gross National Happiness, GNH.
GNH,
yeah.
Gross National Happiness. So is it similar to that? Because they tried to, I guess, come up with some parallel statistics or analog statistics to the GNP or GN numbers. Is it similar?
It's certainly inspired by my many, many years of working in Bhutan and Ladakh. So I've observed change in Ladakh, which is West Tibet, now over 40 years. And I came there when it first opened up to the outside world, and I learned to speak the language fluently. I was a linguist. And I encountered people who were happier than any I had ever known. And I had grew up in Sweden, I'd lived in America, England, Germany, France, quite a few countries. And I had never encountered people who were just so relaxed about who they were, who had such deep self-esteem, and who were just so vital and vibrant. In fact, I met the Dalai Lama in the first year and had many meetings with him, but I found that almost every farmer, almost everyone in the culture was just like him, just radiating a certain joy, vitality, and peace.
Okay, now when you speak in these terms, a lot of people listening will say, you know, that sounds great, but it sounds economically impossible because the demands of the economy for growth are such that if we all pursued this kind of economics of happiness, that there would be a shortfall at the end of the day. And but what we're finding in the 21st century is that the current system is leading to shortfalls anyway. We know the environmental constraints of the economy are evident in China. They're evident around the world. The system right now is failing miserably. People are calling for revolution. You got Russell Brand calling for revolution. And I think actually, we were talking earlier, you mentioned Pepe Grillo in Italy as an interesting example of a revolutionary who got very far in the political process. So Russell Brand could look at this as an example, right?
I definitely think so. I've been working with his movement in Italy. It's called the 5-Star Movement. What he did, he's a sort of Italian Russell Brand, really. He was a comedian, he had a huge following, and he started saying about 8 years ago, the system is completely corrupt, no point voting, we need a people's movement for systemic change. And they started a people's movement basically from zero in 2006, and by 2012, they took 30% of the vote. They took half of Berlusconi's vote. What they had done was I think it was important that Beppe was sort of famous, so he had a certain following. After that, they didn't use the media, they used the internet. And very importantly, they encouraged people to meet up locally. So there were local groups all around the country, and they started running people in the local elections.
So Pepe Grillo, you know, in Italy, he took this idea, this revolution.
Yeah.
He's an entertainer, comedian, but he captured the public zeitgeist. He got 30% of the vote, got very far in the political process. So when the Russell Brand example, you know, that could translate into the UK, because the UK is becoming very dysfunctional in a lot of ways. The wealth and income gap is widening enormously, and so this could actually happen. And you know, Russell's an articulate guy, smart guy, could certainly be a leader in a lot of ways. You know, I've reached out to the Conservative Party here in the UK, principally Zach Goldsmith, who I know from The Ecologist magazine. He seems to be somebody with his heart in the right place. Can conservatives in this country ever really get the same kind of attention and credibility, one would say, of a Russell Brand now?
I think that they can. I mean, because I really think it goes beyond left and right. And I think both Russell and Zach, who's worked with me for 10 years, they go beyond the left and right, which has become meaningless. We all know that. And they are both talking about something fundamentally different. They're talking about systemic change. That's what we need.
Okay, now let's talk about this rise of inequality in the economy right now. It's really extraordinary. It's go back historically, you find periods, the Gilded Age, for example, and other periods where you have this enormous gap in wealth, and it does lead to revolutions. It does lead to social unrest, and we see that all over the world now. What are your thoughts now in the UK specifically? How do you see this playing out? Do you agree that there is this huge inequality and that it's rising? Because according to the current government, it's not really happening, and it's not really something to be concerned about.
I would say it's something to be very concerned about, and especially when you study it globally, as I have, working with 50 different language groups. They translated our book and film, Ancient Futures, into 50 languages. So we have contact with grassroots networks on every continent. In every single country, the gap between rich and poor is widening dramatically. Why? Because we've allowed, through trade treaties, this quiet takeover of governments. So basically, when we elect politicians, when they get into power, they're singing to the tune of global capital, not to the tune of the voter. And that's true also in Scandinavia, you know, where I come from originally.
If I said that this TTIP trade agreement that's in place now, if it comes to the UK, that in effect the UK government defers to a global authority and lose its sovereignty in the UK to some degree. Is that a fair statement? Or
Absolutely fair statement. Not only that, it means that governments are going to be sued if they do anything to protect their citizens or their environment from foreign investors.
I mean, that's an amazing...
Investment becomes law. Foreign investment becomes the rule. Democracy is a joke.
I want to repeat this because this is an amazing fact.
Out.
In other words, these foreign corporations can sue the UK government if they feel that their profits are being impinged upon by actions. It could be activists, it could be democracy seekers in the government, and they get sued, and then the government is forced by law to collect taxes to pay compensatory damages to foreign corporations.
Yes. And of course, it's very similar to what already happened in 2008 when the taxpayer ends up subsidizing giant banks. This has been going on, and we already have cases of corporations suing governments for trying to protect their citizens. So we really need to wake up to this. I mean, for me, it's very hopeful because I have been watching this process for 40 years now. And I found that about 30 years ago, it was possible to get into the media, at least in Scandinavia and even a little bit in England and so on. But then as corporations gain more power through these trade treaties that have been accelerating and becoming more and more dramatically undemocratic, particularly since the mid-'80s, the silencing in the media has been terrible. And it's so hard to understand quite how it works. I mean, even now, just a month ago, I was in Italy, and I was being interviewed by a big paper, and I mentioned TTIP, and later on they cut that out. And when we asked the journalist, why did you do that? He said, I didn't want to get too technical. And that is an argument we've had over the years, that people think it's too dry, it's too technical, and therefore people won't be interested.
Well, the media is suffering from an ecological crisis as well. In the ecological space, you have the problem of monocultures.
Yeah.
You know, you have one type of banana, for example, that dominates the global banana trade, or one type of crop, and it gets susceptible to disease. And then you open up the gates to control by corporations like Monsanto, et cetera. But in the media space, it's simply you have a monoculture. It's in the UK, it's really the BBC.
Yeah.
The BBC and a little peripheral contribution by Channel 4 and others. But this is not, they're not operating in the public interest anymore because they seem to be operating in the corporate interest.
Another thing that I
Would you
deal
agree with that?
Absolutely. And because partly what's happening is that the global economy is imposing a biological monoculture, but also a human monoculture. And I first had my eyes open to this in Ladakh and Bhutan. When I first arrived, no one ever said to me, it's better to have lighter skin and be taller and have a bigger nose and blue eyes, and I'm ugly and backward with my brown skin and my brown eyes. Absolutely none of that. And I witnessed firsthand, speaking the language fluently, how media, advertising, films, and tourism to some extent presented this total image, romanticized basically a white urban consumer culture, made people feel stupid and backward, and the loss of self-esteem combined with suddenly creating unemployment, which had never existed before. And this is happening in China and all over India too. Combining the loss of self-esteem with the loss of jobs leads to local ethnic friction and conflict. So from my point of view, most of the fundamentalism we're finding today, whether Christian or Islamic, Hindu, even Buddhist, xenophobia, racism, neo-Nazism, are all on the rise because of a human monoculture that also destroys people's right to provide for themselves and their families.
It's
when you
almost
do
like,
that to men,
I don't want to get overly dramatic about this,
but this dramatic.
It almost sounds like a media-driven eugenics.
It
you know,
is, but
there's
it's
the
not.
white, blue-eyed model,
Yeah.
and they're not taking people in the operating room and trying to carve them up and perform experiments of that nature. But through the media, they're portraying the white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired person.
Yeah.
And if you don't fit the category, you might as well just kill yourself.
Yeah, but you know what? It took me several years to realize when I came back to Sweden to find that 6-year-old girls who were blue, blonde-eyed, thin, beautiful, were saying, I'm not going to eat anything, I want to be as thin as Barbie. Sometimes, you know, starving themselves to death. And I realized also that in America, in a way, a culture that's been more subjected to this corporate hegemony than any other culture, the self-hatred and the self-destruction is even greater than in places like China and India, because there's still more community, and in the West we're more isolated.
Right, so your main theme would say localism is a huge theme in what you do.
Yeah.
And this is, and so to put in context these various themes, a lot of it has to do with the fact you're destroying the localism, local culture in deference to a global culture that is, it lacks a lot, it's corporate driven, and therefore it's not in the best interest of these communities. And we have about a minute left, and I just wanted to speak that you're going to be in New York City shortly at an event. Can you tell us about that?
Thank you. It's called Voices of Hope in a Time of Crisis, and we're going to be launching our International Alliance for Localization. We'll have people from virtually every continent, and I hope people come. It's at Cooper Union on November the 8th. You can look it up on our website, theeconomicsofhappiness.org. November the 8th at Cooper Union. It's an historic event. We are unique in that we're working globally to promote localization. And localization is not just about buying local, it's about rebuilding local economies, and in so doing, rebuilding the local community structure. It's about imposing regulations on corporations and banks that they need to be localized, in the sense they need to belong to a place, to a country, and adhere to the rules of that country.
To protect the public domain, the common common space, and there's got to be a common space for us, and the corporations need to have a space, but it needs to be contained.
Needs
anyway,
to be contained.
We're out of time, so thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Helena Norberg-Hodge. She'll be speaking at the Cooper Union in New York City on November 8th. Go to localfutures.org to learn more. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.